Do you mind?
Okay.
Share your screen. Can you go one more down? Sweet. Thanks.
Okay, so while I'm sharing my screen, I cannot see the rest of the Zoom box. So just let me know when you have a lot of participants and you're ready to get started. I'll wait a couple more minutes here.
Yeah, we have 2 people so far. I think we'll wait a couple of minutes and then we'll need to get started one way or the other. So Beth, you could start your little preliminary, I would guess.
My little preliminary. Say again?
But while we're waiting, I mean, people can just share. Mhm.
Yeah, sure. Oh, I think, you know what? We didn't update that too. I think people can just talk, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So it says chat box, but the people who are with us, if you want to just tell us, you know, we have a lot of experience sitting and looking at you here. So we have a whole presentation ready, but we're also prepared to adjust and answer questions and make it more individualized to whoever's with us. So if you want to guide us, it's a great time because we will follow your lead. If I may just continue chatting here, just because if the ages and kind of what your roles make a difference in terms of kind of what we lean into some more and what we emphasize. So again, that's just helpful if anybody wants to share out.
How about if the couple of people who are on the line
There we go. Oops, got a little feedback there. Wait, is that you, Chris?
Hang on, guys. Sorry.
Hey, there's one type chat comment from Sarah. Great.
Oh, there we go. Great. Great. It's disabled. So thanks for figuring out. So apparently,
No, we're seeing it.
It's the Q&A box. Sorry, Matt, to interrupt you. It's the Q&A box, not the chat box. My apologies. Thank you for finding it. High school. Should we get started?
So I would just say for Sarah, you may also want to, we're doing another webinar on the 29th where I'm talking about the differences between an IEP and a 504 plan. So if your child has ADHD, that's often a question that comes up. So you might want to check out that webinar also that's on the website as well.
Okay, guys, should we get started? Matt, do you want to start on the Who Are We page?
Sure, I'm Matt Cohen. I'm the founder of Matt Cohen and Associates, and I've been functioning as a lawyer representing families of kids with disabilities for over 40 years and deal with all areas of disability and all types of conflicts with schools, and have been very happy to build this law firm, which includes these two wonderful advocates. So take it away, Elizabeth.
I am Elizabeth. I'm a teacher by trade. I started off in general ed, mostly a special education teacher. I worked in a variety of different settings and ages. And then I was a private advocate before working with Matt, and I've had the privilege of working with Matt for the last almost going on 8 years pretty soon here now. And then I get to continue to teach through private executive functioning coaching. So I don't know if you can see, there's a board behind me with a lot of mysterious letters, different mnemonic devices.
And I'm Christine Palmieri. I'm an advocate, and I have a lot of experience advocating for families in Chicago public schools. I have a 15-year-old, my son is autistic, and he currently attends a therapeutic day school. I've been a member of Speak with Matt, the Special Education Advocacy Coalition of Chicago. We've been advocating for families for, I believe, 5+ years now. And I'm a current CPS Board of Education Special Education Committee member.
So I'm going to just do a very, very fast overview of the one sentence in the special education realm that is the single most important sentence that governs how kids get services if they have disabilities and qualify for an IEP. And that's that students have a right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And so that really breaks down into two phrases. One is, what is an appropriate education? And the other is, what's the least restrictive education or setting for the child to be educated? The word appropriate has been the source of hundreds, if not thousands, of lawsuits trying to understand what it means. And essentially, we can think of the word appropriate as covering the question of what quality of education is a student entitled to. And historically, schools took the position that they were only required to provide a minimal amount of education that was sufficient for the child to receive some progress or benefit. And if they were doing that, then they had discharged their duties, even if there were more things that could be done. A couple of years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court expanded that standard to say, well, some benefit is really not demanding enough. And they said that schools, in a very helpful new statement of obligation, said schools were obligated to provide the child with, quote unquote, an ambitious program designed to allow the child to meet challenging objectives. I still don't know what that means. Nobody else knows what that means, but we can understand it to mean more than what had been required of the schools, to it just a little bit of benefit. But from my own perspective, and this is my talking, not a court, or it's certainly not the Supreme Court talking, if we think about what constitutes a challenging goal, I would say something is challenging if it is causing the person to function at the outer limit of what they are capable of. And so we want to have goals that are not impossible or unaccomplishable, but that are likely to stretch them to the limit of what they're capable of with appropriate support. The other thing that's important to know is, because this is a qualitative standard, you have rights to participate in this process, to go to IEP meetings, to get information, even to challenge the school. But just because you want something or feel it's desirable doesn't mean the school automatically has to do it. So you have to be able to demonstrate, often with educational or clinical evidence, why it is that something is appropriate or necessary. And then while that's going on, the school is also supposed to be trying to provide the service in the least restrictive environment that is available to meet the child's needs to get an appropriate education. And the word appropriate comes up. In fact, it's a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment appropriate to meet their needs. So that's almost doubling up. But the point being that it isn't regular ed no matter what, and it isn't the most restrictive no matter what. It's the level of intensity or restrictiveness that is necessary. That's a big word in special education. Try to use necessary rather than ideal or desirable or beneficial. What is the level of intensity or programming that is necessary for the child to make meaningful progress? Okay, so that's a good quick overview. So let's move on to the next one.
That's me. All right. So as Matt is talking about trying to stretch the outer limits, and in teacher language too, that's often called zone of proximal development. So right at, you can do this, but what's right beyond what you're able to do independently, and keep stretching you, right? So that's also a really good thing for the students to be aware of, as well as what is my zone of proximal development. So I highly suggest, as you're trying to figure out what are your priorities and how to advocate with the team, because as Matt was saying, you really have to, you can't get everything. So we suggest you prioritize, is to figure out what's going on with the student, and that you're making it a very deliberate and very early on, you're using developmentally appropriate practices that work for the student, to make sure that the student is included in the educational process, and that they get the information that they need to be meaningfully included. It's also a good way to be able to assess if a student is getting that FAPE, and to encourage engagement, right? Is again to ask the student, how are you doing? And maybe even have formal measures to be able to solicit the student's feedback. So again, and as well as, if I may, 14 and a half, all students are invited to be a part of the IEP, but they can be a part of the IEP earlier. And there are a number of student facilitated IEPs. There's a lot of ways to help that are research-based programs already existing to facilitate students with a variety of needs and abilities to be meaningfully engaged in their educational programming. Did I hear somebody try to say something, by the way? Sarah, you trying to say something?
No, sorry, I'm in my car and I'm trying not to be disruptive, but I realized I had it off of mute, and so sorry. Thank
Great.
you.
No, you're great. Just want to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And then, sometimes students, they don't have the information, so finding ways to get students informed so they can make decisions and be involved. So a couple ways, there's a couple of ideas here, but I'm going to highlight that last one, right? Where you're facilitating opportunities to talk with, where either maybe the family is talking with staff, the student is talking with staff, or pairing with older peers. Vygotsky he's a Russian developmental theorist. I'm a big fan. And he talks about, actually, he's also the zone of proximal development, but he talks about the benefits of students who are just a little bit older and giving information. And there's a rich movement there. And I see that some programs, for instance, in high school, they have partnerships where like older upperclassmen will support younger class. And then given the students' needs, there are a variety of ways to facilitate communication. We have a number of webinars about that as well. Next slide. So accountability. So again, what the IEP says is one thing, which is very important to make sure that it's clearly written in measurable terms, that anybody could pick it up and understand what the program is, right? So after, though, it's written in the IEP, you want to make sure that it's actually being followed through with fidelity. And a good way to do that is to be proactive and create systems. So one way that I absolutely counted on as a special ed teacher, and now I encourage families to advocate for, is this weekly schedule that really lays out what is a student doing on at any given time, any given day. Where are they supposed to be? What are they supposed to be doing? Is there, if they have an aide with them, who is supposed to be with them? So it's a really nice way to, again, for the school to keep track, for you to keep track. And then I've also, personally, I've used it as a means of, as a format for data collection as well. Like, how engaged are we during this time, a variety of forms. But again, it's a really nice, clear way for people to know, how is this IEP being implemented on the day-to-day? Data collection, there's a whole lot of language here, but I'm also going to really emphasize goals, right? Goals drive programming, or they should. I'm going to rattle off a couple of components that all good goals should have: behavior, condition, criteria, context. So that criteria, what are the measurable components of the goals? hopefully that's part of what the team is also collecting data about. You might also, if there is some disagreement about data, this can also be a way to collect baseline information and maybe advocate and maybe even steer the team towards working on areas of need, areas that you see as need. But again, please don't assume what and how the team is collecting data. A nice way to not make that assumption is to ask that there is a system and get that documented in the IEP for how regularly, like once a week, you get and through what format, through an email, who's going to do it, the case manager, what is that going to include, an update on progress on what goals you worked on this week, right? So very is clearly spelled out as you can, so that you can point at it and say in the IEP, this is what it is. And so we're very clear for accountability's sake. Homeschool communication, I mean, we have a whole webinar about this, and we could speak for days about how to do it, the importance of it, and problem solving around it. But what we want to emphasize in this is just really that you identify what are your priorities, what are forms and timing that work for you, and then try to work with the other team to find something that's mutually agreeable. And again, I was a part of that webinar, so I think it was helpful. A good one. The link is right there. And then again, special education documentation is so much the name of the game. A lot of where again, Matt was saying that where you generate, a way to generate the evidence, as Matt was talking about how to establish need, is by going through the records. And again, the more clear and the more accurate and the more thorough those records are, the easier, the better it is to be able to compare, is this progress meaningful over time, right? Are we working on the same goals? Right, we're working on the same skills. So that's a really nice way to be able to track, as well as, again, there are many, many methods. I'm going to highlight one in particular. I know I was schooled to do this, is to do a phone call. Don't have things in paper. Schools will call you up and say, oh, maybe you email and say, hey, I have a question, and then you get a phone call from the school. Oftentimes schools will take the phone call, follow up with an email. Right? And say, hey, this is my understanding of our conversation. Please clarify anything. So that's a really nice way of continuing to move forward with communication, hopefully in a form and fashion that works for you in the school, as well as get that documentation there. And then one little trick I often use, if there's some pushback from the team, like, oh, this is what we do anyways, why do we have to write this down? Is I say some things like, well, if the family were to move, right? I just want to make sure that the other team is very clear on what the programming should be.
I say if the family, if the staff become ill.
Writing that one down. I'm all set with that slide. Chris, can you move to the next slide? Thanks. That's you.
So I can go over knowing your IEP. One of the big areas that we talk about a lot is a team might say, well, let's wait and see at the beginning of the school year. Let's wait and see how the schedule, sort of plays out. Let's see how the first couple of weeks go, etc. Well, we really advocate for a getting systems in place immediately approach versus the waiting and seeing. And you know your child best. So for many students, a smooth transition into the school year is imperative for a successful school year for them. So it's important to let this team know that if having schedules and structures and routines in place is important, that you can reach out and make sure that those things are set. It's also helpful, at the beginning of the school year to make sure that your IEP team is aware of the IEP document and that it's going to be implemented with fidelity. So circling back to, looking at the schedule, making sure that the minutes align, and also how's the team going to monitor. So there's a couple of different ways, how the team is going to be accountable to the IEP. There's ways that you can request observation, the data collection that Elizabeth referenced, reviewing the records, and fidelity checks. One of the easiest way, or one way that's a really good resource for parents, is to try to volunteer in the classroom. So to try to observe and be a presence. There's also ways to request a formal observation. So CPS sometimes likes to tell families that they're not able to do an observation in class. That's not correct. They do have a form And you do have to find an agreeable time during the day and an amount of time, but you are allowed to observe your child's classroom. Virtual observations are also an option, or you could ask the team to take videos of the student and send home. Other questions to ask is just to make sure that you have an understanding of how the team is collaborating with each other. Our students have different classes, different teachers throughout the day, and you want to make sure that they're consulting with each other, if they have professional developments, if there's training opportunities, and so on. And these are just some examples of how to know your IEP at the beginning of the school year. Elizabeth is going to go over her IEP overview template, which is phenomenal. Here we go.
Before you do that, I want to make one comment that relates really to comments that both of you have just made. There is an element of the IEP process that I would say is akin to going into a party where you don't know anybody and you're either greeted with open arms by many people or you feel all alone and it's hard to communicate with anybody. It's hard to anticipate how the party is going to go. And the issue of what you ask for, both in terms of content and documentation, you could think of that in the social milieu as you're making chit chat and how are people going to respond to it. And they may respond in a very favorable way, or they may respond in a very defensive way. And so in this case, the requests for things like access, like information, like accountability measures, like communication, those are all things that you are entitled to ask for, and within reason that schools are expected to provide if it's reasonable. But there's no set of rules that define exactly what that looks like. And some teams respond to that openly and are very cooperative, and other teams view that as kind of an intrusion or a threat, and they get more withdrawn and get defensive in reaction to it. So you have to be constantly, the social party analogy I'm making, you have to be reading the room as you go step by step to see what reaction you're getting, and is this proving to be successful or not. And that's kind of a paradox, because if you're encountering defensiveness, in some respects, that's even more reason that you want to get more accountability and information. But the more that you ask, the more defensive they may become, and it may set up a cycle that's a negative one. So you have to just be very careful as you go. And again, the comment we've made several times already now is you have to prioritize about the things that you're asking for to decide, is this the moment? Is this the thing that I want to really push? Or is this something, because I'm getting some negative feedback or vibes about it, maybe I need to back off and just give it a little more time and see how it goes. On the other hand, as an ultimate comment about all of this, if your kid's at risk or something really bad is happening, gotta speak up. So that's sort of an important absolute.
Actually, one second before I move on to the next one, I want to. So speaking of this idea of that there can be a little controversy, this idea, or again, just read the room, right? Think about what are your advocacy strategies, what are you trying to get accomplished, and then try to align your efforts with that. For instance, this fidelity check, right, where we say, "Hey, administrator, could you just pop in every once in a while and unannounced and see that the IEP is being implemented as followed?" I inevitably get pushback about that. So that's a real controversial one. I just probably want to put that out there that if you, there's almost, I've gotten a lot of negative reactions. So you might want to pull that ripcord mindfully, right? And there are other ways to kind of, again, address that. And a lot of the other components are a little softer ways to do that. And that's why you put the fidelity checks at the end of that list, because it can be touchy, right? And then just a real quick plug for the virtual observations. As a person who used to get to regularly observe, both as a classroom teacher and then as a private advocate, it is hard to get, because you can't lean in, you can't follow kids around, you have to stay in one spot. You can't really hear as much, right? But with the video, it's less intrusive, it's a little bit more authentic, and oftentimes you can hear more. So the IEP template, this is a form that I used when I was a teacher. I started off doing it just for my own sake, so that I could keep track of, who were the kids coming in. So I would take the IEP and I would boil it down to this one-page document. And then I'm sorry, I'm repeating what you're going to see on if you watch the webinar on the homeschool, but it was just such a momentous thing here. where my job as an inclusion teacher was to make sure that the school staff understood and could implement the IEP as written. So I had many different incarnations. One was, here's the IEP. No one looked at it. Here's the IEP with like flags on it and color coded. Nobody looked at it. And I know this because they would go back, because I had to collect the IEPs because it's confidential information. They go to the shelf, they dig through, and they literally wipe off the dust and they'd hand it back to me. I sat down, I walked through, all different incarnations. And then I would start, and then I had this aha moment. I was brushing my teeth going, why don't I just give them this form? And then this form was coffee stained, was used, and the people would pull it out all the time. It was marked confidential in subfolders. It was very powerful for school staff. So I know both. This is extremely empowering, both as an educator, and now I know as a parent, to be able to fill out this form. You really know the IEP very well, and you start to see if there's some holes in there. Like you say, how are these goals being measured, and how does it relate to the present levels? And the goals have nothing to do with the present levels. It really helps you kind of see at a glance and help to communicate in a very effective manner. Again, I'm saying I used to put this in my folder for aides, right, as teaching assistants. Everybody would look at this and go, wow, this is really helpful. Again, and we currently help families craft this as well. So again, they're empowered and find a method of not only sharing the components of the IEP so they feel more confident that the staff know, but it's also, again, that increased level of accountability, because I know you know whatever IEP components because I gave you the sheet of paper. That's all I got for that.
So I'll go over some signs of early problems. And there's a comment in the chat talking about why not use your procedural safeguards. So that's exactly what we're doing. Those procedural safeguards, you have a right to them. What we're talking about today is a little bit of when the team sort of pushes back on your right to your procedural safeguards and some other ways to address that, while you're really just citing your rights. And sometimes it can be really helpful to remind the team or to show them the procedural manual or things like that. And these are some examples of areas of concern that might pop up right in the beginning weeks of the school year, and some possible solutions. These are just some. So for example, if you're starting to get calls from the teacher, especially, calls in the middle of the day about behavior, asking you to pick up your child, et cetera, or discussing concerns that are known, relation to their disability profile that might show you that the teacher or the staff is not aware or haven't read the IEP, et cetera. Sometimes teachers are reporting things that just don't fit with your knowledge of your child. For example, saying the child is deaf when you know that they can hear. If you're getting slow or incomplete responses from the school team, that's definitely an early warning sign. And Elizabeth talked a lot about those data points. So that homeschool communication logs are coming home to you, but it doesn't reflect the call that you got home that day related to behavior or asking you to pick up your child. So definitely pay attention to how your students feeling. If they're coming home anxious, if there's a lot of dysregulation and distress, and if you're seeing an increase in meltdowns either before or after school, or if your child is starting to experience school refusal, it's time to step in. For example, some possible solutions here are repeating, we'll just keep saying this, creating a paper trail through repeated targeted communication with the team in writing. You have a right to call an IEP meeting at any time. You can prioritize, or change the priorities of the goals and services within the IEP, or either request a reevaluation based on newly, identified needs by the team, or request that a pending evaluation be expedited. You can always go up the administrative chain. So contact your district representative, department heads, or the director. These are just some possible solutions. Again, we'll go over some more here on this slide. Additional concerns could be brand new behaviors that you weren't aware of that your child is experiencing. That can be everything from repeating language or modeling behavior of peers in class that you hadn't seen before. A big thing to pay attention to is if your student is lost, they don't know what the assignments are, they don't know when the due dates are, they're starting to have sort of a buildup of assignments and et cetera that they're not able to complete right off at the start of the year. Try to pay attention to the work that's coming home, and pay attention if they're working on material that is either too high or too low curriculum wise for them. And if your student's reporting that key staff, like their aide or their special education teacher or the OT, is absent, or they've had different people serving them throughout the day, if they've had a sub para for quite an amount of time, etc., trying to identify if the staff is staying consistent. And some ways to address those areas might be, you can, again, we talked about that you can request an observation at any time. You can also request that your private clinicians be able to come in and evaluate the classroom. You can request an independent evaluation. Can request when it's really getting to be a point of challenge. For example, if your student is not responding well to their specific paraprofessional, it's possible to request for a change of staff. But it's important to note that school has autonomy in staffing decisions. There's not always a lot of staff availability, etc. So be aware that the request might be met with a denial. And that applies to if you're sort of looking to either change schools as an option. So that's intradistrict. We have changing school districts. Yeah.
Yeah, for just a second, I'm thinking about that, the changing of the staff, and that how it is really difficult to say, I'd like a different staff person. But one way to maybe circumvent that is to talk about the training of the staff person, and to get, again, needs-based, right? If you can demonstrate that a student has a need for instance, maybe an aide that's trained in BCBA, right? ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. And so then again, if the team agrees, there are people that's what they're trained to do, and you get it written into the IEP. And then that means that if they're called RBTs, the people who are trained to do ABA. If that RBT is absent, they can't just pull in a sub, right? They have to be trained to match the level that's on the IEP. So we wouldn't necessarily say, we need Miss Smith to be doing it, but we need the level of training that Miss Smith has, right? That someone can sign, that someone has maybe, this training. Again, that's a rich place to be able to try to inform staffing, as well as the supports for school personnel is a component of the IEP that I see is rarely used, where it really lays out what does in pretty specific terms, what does the staff need to know in order to meet the students' unique needs? And then that can be, again, a way to kind of get at what are the needs and how does the school need to address it. I think Matt's going to say something. No?
Yeah, just back on the issue of change of staff. This is a tricky one. And one of the things that makes it tricky is that you're trying to balance getting a resolution, having documentation, and avoiding putting the administration in a defensive posture. And so one of the things that I often recommend is, if you have a complaint or a desire to change staff based on a problem with a particular staff person or a few particular staff people, it may be desirable to talk about that privately with the director of special ed or the principal, as opposed to at the IEP or 504 meeting, because once you bring it up publicly in the context of the whole team, it often puts the administrator in the position where they feel they have to support their team, because if they go along with your request for a change of staff, it appears that they're accepting that there was something wrong with what the staff was doing. And so there can be sometimes pushback where the administrator has to say publicly, no, you're not, you don't have any say about personnel decisions, and we're going to stay continuing doing what we're doing now. If you do that privately, they may be more willing to do a move that accomplishes what you want without officially calling out the staff person that you're dissatisfied with.
We got a question in here about, I'm just going to read it if I may. In a scenario where the student has a self-advocacy goal, but when self-advocating is dismissed by the teacher, what would be the solution? Well, a thought is to first go back to the way the language of the goal is written. And again, behavior, condition, criteria, context, behavior is the skill written in clearly objective, measurable terms. If not, then maybe relook at that. And then I would try to get on the record that the teacher is saying, no, I am not going to implement this, and ask for why. And then maybe start to go up the chain, right? Start to include, maybe CC their boss. And then again, depending on, as Matt is really emphasizing, and we really want to emphasize, how you approach the team really depends on what you're advocating for, right? Because you don't want to just bull in a china shop, right? Just go in without being mindful of what you're really trying to accomplish, right? So if your mind's eye is, I'm trying to forge a really trusting relationship with this teacher, you might say something like, I'm a little confused. Can you help me understand? If you're feeling, or again, I don't mean to be so, there are a lot of gradations of ways to do this here, but an alternative could also be that you more assertively say, because you have concerns about the teacher, maybe they've said some comments like, I don't want kids like your kid in my class. You maybe more assertively say, maybe start to include the administrator a little earlier on. I am concerned that the IEP is, we're out of compliance with the IEP. A little bit more stronger language. And there are tidbits you can see even within Matt's language and a number of our webinars where you can just pull out certain language like appropriate, meaningful, challenging, and pepper that in. Administrators know, they know what you're talking about, right? And then that also helps create the paper trail to show, look, I clearly demonstrated need. I hope that helped.
I think too, like self-advocacy is such a challenge, especially for like our high school age students, because a teacher will often say like, well, I don't really understand why they need this goal because yesterday they asked for help. And, it's, if there's room for it, talking to the teacher about why that goal is there and why it's a challenge for your student. Maybe they're not able to consistently self-advocate. Maybe some days we're over self-advocating and other days we're not asking the right questions or missing the information or nervous to ask the questions. So I think, and it can be hit or miss. Some teachers understand the value of the IEP and those executive functioning goals, those self-advocacy goals. Other teachers, especially in those high school environments, might feel like it's not necessary. Like all kids should have these skills today, and you should be able to understand my incredibly complex Google Classroom and all of the assignments that are there. And I'm not welcome to, questions. But I think that Elizabeth gave some really good tips on where to start. And it's very important to make sure that you're following through with the team and making sure they're following the IEP with fidelity. Self-advocacy is a really important goal. So.
If there's a consistent failure to provide attention to one or more goals, in an ultimate conflict, there may be a basis to ask for what's called compensatory education, if the goal is not being addressed, to make up for what hasn't been provided, let's say, over a several month or school year period. Iona, that was your question about self-advocacy. It leads me to want to make another broad comment that may be confusing, and I don't mean to, what I'm going to say isn't contradictory to what Elizabeth and Chris just said, but the procedural safeguards are the law, and yet there's a lot of inconsistency about how they're interpreted, and even more inconsistency about how they're implemented. And it's a lot of work to get them to be implemented properly and consistently, and sometimes can lead to great conflict. And so the reality is, and this is kind of shocking coming from a lawyer, but in some ways, the procedural safeguards are aspirational rather than real. And so you need to be cognizant of, again, I hate to beat a dead horse, but how do you prioritize? Is this something that's a procedural issue and my kid is being injured because it's not being done correctly? And so I'm really going to make a big stink about this, versus what you will encounter is many situations with teams where there are lots of technical violations of things that are not really, they may qualitatively degrade the program in its totality, but they're not critical to your child's success or failure. Those might be things you decide, we're going to put those on the back burner. I'll just give this is by analogy, but I had a wonderful client many years back. I don't think Elizabeth or Chris have even heard this story. She was a professor of English, And when she got the IEPs, she took out a red pen and she would go through the IEPs and correct all of the grammatical errors that were in the IEPs and send them back. And she had a very important motivation for that. And it was a legitimate issue, which is, I expect my teachers to know the English language and to know how to write and to understand the rules of grammar. And if they're not doing that in the IEP, how can I trust that they're going to be doing that with my daughter in her English class? So that was a very legitimate complaint, and in some respects, a very legitimate strategy to use. But it had the effect of completely infuriating the IEP teams. And there were other issues that were ultimately of more importance to that child's education than whether the grammar rules were being followed in the IEP or not. But because the mother was making an issue of those things, it obscured her ability to solve the bigger problem she had. So we had to talk about, you're right, but is this the fight you want to have?
So goals, services, and accommodations can also help you prioritize and help the team and you, again, be on the same page about what are those priorities. And this should all and also lead towards transition programming and preparing for adulthood. So in just a few ideas of ways of goals you might request, so to help facilitate getting things done at home. So absolutely homework goals, right? That their homework is done accurately, it's on time, that the students are packing up materials. So we're preparing for, again, that adulthood, independent functioning, right? I can organize my materials, I can get out the door, right? Further education, I can complete hopefully, I can complete work that I've been taught independently and demonstrate my knowledge. And then, future employment too, getting ready for a job. So these are all really important skills that, again, you should be tracking as we're going, but you can help weave into the IEP to help, again, provide the instruction that is needed and get the support for home as well. So I know a lot of students, again, this check-in, check-out, and initial planners where they're like, I'd like to help my student, but I'm spending hours and hours trying to figure out where the stuff is. What website do the teacher are the teachers putting things on? Just an inordinate amount of time trying to navigate things when it could just be very clearly written out in a planner, or I'm going to skip down to the homeschool communication. Or again, we have an understanding that from this teacher, they wrote out, okay, hey, if you want the math notes, you go with these 3 steps, right? Oh, this is just our understanding. So again, having an understanding of where is that needed material? What is my kid responsible for doing that? And again, if they're stuck, what are some supports for getting that done? And you can weave a lot of those into the accommodations as well as the services, right? So for instance, special education instructors can help support executive functioning goals like completing homework, organizing materials, packing up correctly. And then real quickly, I did see that there's a couple older people here or with students with high schoolers. Homework can often be, and that homework routine can be a chore for the whole family, right? If a student is resistant, and again, that can also be a real indicator. If a student is coming home with work that they're supposed to be doing independently and they are struggling, that can be a sign that either they're not getting the instruction in class that's making sense to them, right? Or that the homework is not aligned with what's going on. And so again, that's one of those signs. Please look, right? If the student is maybe showing some behaviors instead of doing the homework, well, we'll dig into that, right? There might be something about the task, right? How to do what resources to do that they're struggling with. And then, I talk to parents all the time, family parties at the park and different things. And I'm just thinking about how often when I'm talking to different families, this idea of capitalizing on student strengths comes up, right? If the student is a mover, right? They're athletic. Well, instead of sitting, like we have to sit and do flashcards and drill, why don't they bounce a ball, run and say it, throw something? And I'll be honest, I get a lot of feedback that just, wow, that dramatically changed not only the dynamics at home, so it isn't quite so forced and icky, but the student is actually more meaningfully learning. And you really get a sense of this. Not only does the adult get a sense of the kid, but the student gets a sense of what works for themselves as well to inform going forward. And again, that last page, I just put a whole lot of information, a lot of ideas on there, just again to emphasize and give ideas for how to get that collaboration, so that to streamline that homework routine.
And this slide shows resources that are available. Obviously, Matt's book, Special Education Advocacy. This link is firm resources. We have past webinars. And also this webinar and the PDF of this webinar is going to be posted on our website as well. And all of these resources and links are accessible there as well. For example, the ISB website here, Equip for Equality, has a great special education website with information and a helpline. And also the procedural safeguard, right? The CPS procedural manual, things like that. So these are some resources that we have available. And we can open it up for questions.
I see we have one, but if I'm just going to read it, that's okay. But if the team, I think we're continuing to talk about capitalizing on student strengths. But if the team capitalizes on the student's disability, like ADHD or SLD, how should the student approach the homework failure? So there's also a whole band pillar of special education that's called ability awareness. There are a number of programs. Circle of Friends is one. There's just a ton of programs. I see it's gaining more traction. It's one of those ones that was very popular 10, 20 years ago. It's kind of faded, but it's resurging, because it's this idea of we all have abilities. Some, we all have different strengths. We all have different areas of need. And it's focused on helping students understand what is their ability, being able to, and disability, be able to effectively communicate that, and create a network and a community of understanding people who support and are allies. Mike's, I've done ability awareness exercises in, oh golly, preschool. Usually that's a little bit more on the fly. Elementary school and high school. I found most, like as I was saying, most of the ability awareness, you want to make sure you're well informed about what does the students need, what is the family okay with sharing information about, what is the student okay with sharing information about. But then, a lot of times just in the moment, things like, if you want to get Jacob's attention, you really gotta, if you want to make sure Jacob is here and you got to get his attention, right? If I may, though, most of my experiences where I've talked about either formally or informally talking about ability awareness with both people who have identified with disabilities and don't have not disabilities, it usually becomes a conversation where everyone is talking about, oh yeah, sometimes I have a hard time, even if I may or may not have a diagnosis. I have a hard time with people are, to pay attention and to respond, or sometimes I don't feel in the mood for things. And it often really, quote, normalizes the experience, and it's a shared experience. And again, you form allies. So, but if there is capitalizes on the student disability.
Like, for example, it's important, workload is really intense. So if the workload and the homework is there, the high school workload is incredible for the amount of homework that's expected. Elizabeth, you're, sort of talking about how a student can still show that they've mastered the content, or that they've mastered the foundational skills that were being taught without having to do, so and anyone can unmute at any time, but, how might it look like if you're advocating for workload reduction, but being able to show that you've mastered the content in another way?
Actually, if I may, Chris, what you just said is exactly what an accommodation often is that you have reduced homework to mastery. Right. So for instance, I'm thinking of students that I've worked with that brilliant, just really deep OCD, right? So really get stuck on a lot of things. So if we're talking just a lot of, let's just run and gun and get a lot of information out and kind of the superficial, very hard for a deep thinker who wants everything to be correct. So in that instance, we're talking about, okay, again, where that student is trying to get a sense of, how do I first practice that responsibility, going back and forth and making sure I have the materials that I need, which again, that's getting prepared for adulthood. And am I practicing enough to get ready for the assessment, right? So again, that's a lot of internal self-awareness and understanding, but absolutely, it's often called reduced homework to mastery. And usually that's an understanding between the teacher and the student. There's a couple other ways you can make it a little bit more concrete, but I find that makes it, that usually then the teacher defers to not making it exempt. So usually you try to frame it as, you can say every other problem. There's ways you can make it more concrete. But yeah, reducing homework is a great way to address both, if you have a learning disability and ADHD. And I'm also going to put out a plug for assistive technology. There is a place within the IEP, special factors, where it should lay out what are the components of assistive technology, what can be both low tech. Here's a word, here's a bank of transition words, high text, speech to text, variety of things. And I know since COVID, a lot of schools have gone one-to-one and like, here's your Chromebook, kid, right? And there's this idea of, well, I gave you technology, so go use it. Well, sometimes that technology is not a good match for the kid. You can also request, it's called an assistive technology evaluation. I think we have some webinars about that as well. But it should really be focused on what is the student's need and abilities. So you do a feature match, right? So you say, okay, what is their cognitive, motoric, and social needs, right? And then you figure out when do you want to use it, and then you trial it. So I can't say enough about the benefits of both, of using technology to help level the playing field. I hope that addressed that answer question.
There's a chat in addition. If the teacher says, we all have disabilities, so it won't help the student's self-confidence if the IEP goals either. So, that's something that we definitely hear more often than I'd like. But Elizabeth or Matt, do you have any thoughts on how, well, we're all experiencing that same challenge and how to...
Yeah, I think it's ironic, right? We're talking about individualized, experiences, and then this kind of macro. And I know a lot of families, they have a reaction to, maybe they're talking to a staff person, and then that staff person proceeds to talk at length about their own experience and their own. It's like, yeah, we're not talking about your cousin or whatever. We're talking about my kid, which has their own very unique experience. So also, I'm wondering in this instance too, if there could be some, I guess, an anytime pass. So if they're feeling uncomfortable in the moment, anytime they can say, I need to leave. I need to go to some trusted adults because they're saying things we all have that doesn't make sense to me. I don't feel comfortable. And then hopefully like a social worker is one of those people on the anytime pass and is a trusted ally, can go back later to that teacher and say, excuse me, can't be doing this, right? And then also look for means to proactively address that in the IEP. Right? So things like, use positive person-centered language, right? Use, and pardon me, to go back to that supports for school personnel, you can absolutely talk about what training is required so that teachers not only follow the IEP, but they understand they understand this student's disability and their needs. Yeah, bring in some allies. Internal allies are great.
At the risk of sounding highly conflictual, I sometimes think about these relationships in the context of what guerrilla warfare is like. And in a guerrilla warfare situation, the goal is to enlist people who can be supporters within the context of the institution you're struggling with. And I would underscore the importance of that, though I would also, and by the way, it's important to build good relations with the staff, to make nice to the staff, to try to show appreciation for the staff at the same time that you're keeping track of the problems, documenting, raising concerns tactfully, and so on. The more that you have people who can raise the concern internally for you, the better. The only caution I would make is that we also have the experience frequently of staff who will tell the parents something privately that they then won't report or repeat in the IEP meeting or publicly. And so in some ways that can actually end up feeling a bit like a setup for the family, because they're assuming that the staff member is on board when they're not actually willing to stand up publicly and say what's needed. So that can go both ways. But I would say that if there's any one thing to focus on that's important in helping to predict how the relationship's going to go, it's the quality of the interaction, communication, and building the rapport with the members of the team for the child and the parent.
Actually, having said that, Beth, I can think of a couple practitioners where, just as a food for thought too, just to round out, I guess, that some staff people come off as just rude and abrasive when they're actually doing their job. Right. So I'm thinking of a couple of people, one particular person in particular. She was an occupational therapist, the best I've ever had the privilege of working with before or since. Incredibly knowledgeable, always up to date, lots of materials, really good at sharing, phenomenal with the students, really weird with adults at meetings, like really hostile and defensive and just like, really weird. And then I remember telling many times after I kind of figured that out, and the family's like, whoa, what's going on here, right? Very upset about this. I prepare them and I prepare the OT. So again, I'm not going to get to be your special education teacher. However, I'm just suggesting, if you want to make it work, keep an open mind, right? Because sometimes people are really good with adults and really weird with probably the opposite. Sometimes people are really good with adults, not so good with kids. And the opposite can happen as well. And I'll be honest, I'm more of a fan of people who are practitioners who are maybe weird with adults. I can manage that are good practitioners, right? So that's what you really want to emphasize. I know you do good work for the students. So just food for thought there. It's very interesting. Oh, the dynamics of school, right? A microcosm of society.
And anyone, feel free to unmute if you have any additional questions, or use the chat box as well.
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
And this webinar PowerPoint will be posted on our website alongside the dozens of other webinars we have as well.
Excellent. Thanks, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.